Hello, everybody. My name is Cameron Dennis. I'm the president and founder of the Blockchain Acceleration Foundation. We're a 501c3 nonprofit that accelerates blockchain education, development, and adoption by starting university-accredited blockchain courses. We build a bunch of projects together, get people jobs in the space, and yeah, we host these weekly meetups. And today, I am super grateful and excited to have Dandelion Main join us from SourceCred. Dandelion, if you wouldn't mind just starting real quick with a quick introduction of yourself, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Dandelion. I use they, them pronouns. Let's see. I've been in the crypto space for a number of years now. I have a long, sad story that involves losing control of an Ethereum pre-sale wallet, which I won't bore you with. But I was doing open source stuff at Google. I was working on TensorFlow. And I was really thinking about how could we make better incentives around developing open source software and making open source economically sustainable. And then I kind of got rebitten by the crypto bug and really wanted to join in with crypto. And I was hanging out with my friend Juan Benet of Protocol Labs. And that sparked a whole conversation about like how can cryptocurrencies like Filecoin reward all the open source software that they're built on top of, and all the incentive alignment problems once you start asking how would we distribute tokens to open source. It's like, are you going to go by number of lines of code, number of pull requests, popularity, voting contests? Like, it's pretty clear that all these approaches have severe limitations. And the project SourceCred was born out of a desire to create a scalable, decentralized, and incentive robust or incentive compatible system for rewarding open source contributors and rewarding people putting together decentralized protocols. And so that was about 3 years ago. SourceCred is now kind of both in active kind of experimental usage by projects like MakerDAO and Metagame, but most importantly, we're super aggressively dogfooding SourceCred. So everyone working on SourceCred is getting paid just based on the SourceCred algorithm, which is a really great source of experience in figuring out all the rough edges and how we need to improve it.
Cool.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, awesome introduction. And there are people in the audience who do not know what SourceCred is. But before diving into that, I just want to quickly have a really cool announcement of our engagement with Protocol Labs. They actually just agreed to donate $10,000 to us, to the Blockchain Acceleration Foundation, to create a white paper that describes our ambitions to create a fully incentive-aligned and automated tax-exempt nonprofit. And this, to me, is in direct alignment with SourceCred. And we would like to apply SourceCred to, reward people who are contributing to BAF projects, the decentralized. And yeah, so that's sort of like a preface of today's talk. For those who don't know what Protocol Labs is, this is the open source research, development, and deployment laboratory that is the creator of IPFS, Filecoin, P2P, SourceCred, and a lot of other cool projects. Highly recommend you check them out if you haven't. But yeah, just thought I'd say that. And then if you have any questions throughout today's talk, feel free to ask them in the Q&A section in the top right-hand corner of this chat here. I'll be asking the questions towards the end of the talk. But without further ado, Dandelion, can you give a quick explanation of what SourceCred is and sort of the problem? You briefly highlighted what the problem that you're solving, but just high level of what SourceCred is and what Grain is.
Yeah, so I'll start by framing the problem, which is like, let's suppose that we all decided to launch a new crypto project together. And just to make things simple, let's suppose it's a project that does have a native token, so we're launching like a Bitcoin or an Ethereum or something like this. How are we going to distribute those tokens among all the contributors in a way that produces good long-term incentives and is decentralized? So I would say like the most standard model would be we sort of start up a foundation, our cryptocurrency foundation, and this foundation has got like an executive director or a CEO, and this person's kind of choosing who gets how many tokens. This is like the standard model that you'd see in like a venture-backed company. The issue is it's extremely centralized. Like, I think it's so centralized you arguably have like severe regulatory problems because now it's like maybe you're distributing security. But even putting aside the regulatory issues, this is kind of not our vision for how things should work. Like, we shouldn't have to give one person the power to decide how much everyone gets paid. But when you start trying to decentralize it, it turns out to be really difficult to figure out like who's contributing value, how much do they get rewarded for that value. If you make it based on metrics, like maybe number of lines of code, number of questions answered, number of like emojis received. Those tend to all be very easy to game. They're vulnerable to Sybil attacks. If you make it just based on like popularity contests or like people like funding grants, you've got issues with accountability. So SourceCred is trying to build a really principled solution to this problem. The core idea is a sort of algorithmic insight, which is that we can model a project as a graph or network of contributions where contributions build on other contributions, you know, so the contribution of like building a front end maybe depends on the back end. The contribution of like building the front end also depends on contributions of design mocks, of user studies, of all kinds of different work. And we can have the organizing idea or organizing heuristic that a contribution is valuable if it was depended on by other valuable contributions. So it's sort of a recursive idea that, you know, value, you can figure out, back propagate value from things that you definitely liked to all the things that it depended on. And this works across many domains. Like you can say, you know, a module of software is valuable if it was depended on by other useful code. A user study was valuable if it was depended on by the designs that actually got used. A meeting was valuable if it inspired like future work or people getting recruited to the project. And so SourceCred is built around an algorithm called cred rank, which is assigning a score, a cred score to every contribution based on its position in the contribution network. Those of you who hear cred rank may recognize that this is a play on PageRank. The algorithm I've described is basically Google's original algorithm for ranking pages on the web, where a web page is credible if it is linked to by other credible websites. So we're just kind of taking the same concept and applying it to assigning value to contributions and not just to web pages. Now, one of the really neat things about cred is that this is a retroactively updating score. So it's not a token, you can't spend it. And that's really nice because it means it can change over time. And so maybe like Cameron, maybe you make a contribution and it goes right now kind of unseen, unnoticed. No one realizes how important it was, and so you don't get a lot of cred. But then 6 months later, we're like, oh, whoa, Cameron's contribution was actually mind-blowing. This like was dependent on by a ton of work. Then retroactively, your score can go up a bunch. And I think what's really important about having retroactivity in the reward function is it means you can afford to just focus on doing good work and not worrying about like making sure it's been promoted properly every step along the way. So you're gonna say, yeah, maybe nobody understands my genius right now, but like once this whole thing is done, people will think it's awesome, and so it'll get like properly seen then in the future. But we run into the issue that everyone's got to like pay bills, and you can't spend a score because it's retroactively, like who wants to buy something that might retroactively get updated to be much lower value? And so we also have the concept of a token in SourceCred, and that token is called Grain. Grain is sort of a community currency that just gets distributed to people for having done valuable work. So the idea is that within a project using SourceCred, they're distributing Grain every week based on cred scores. And we actually distribute Grain in a way that takes into account the retroactivity. So if you were underpaid in the past because your contributions weren't very valued very highly, but now we see they were actually a lot more important, then we'll give you a lot more Grain to kind of catch you up to where you would have been. And so that kind of,
got it.
Oh, go ahead.
Hey,
no.
real quick,
Yeah.
Dandelion. Yeah, I just want just pump the brakes a little bit for the people who might not be following everything. So wait, how cred is actually like who determines how much cred somebody gets? Like I know that's a very basic question, but if we were trying to apply this, I feel like education is going to be one of the biggest barriers for, you know, adopting this across, you know, entire ecosystems. Would you say that is a challenge? Or I guess I'm asking two questions. One, who actually determines how much cred someone gets? And then two, the role of education and applying this to real world.
So let me become very concrete instead of abstract here. And I'll look at how MakerDAO is using SourceCred. So MakerDAO is I think the largest or one of the largest DAOs, certainly one of the oldest successful DAOs, and they are creating the DAI stable cryptocurrency on the Ethereum network. They have a lot of, MakerDAO is essentially, it's kind of running a bank where people can store Ether and other collateral and in exchange like generate DAI as a form of leverage. And so there needs to be a fair amount of governance in the system around like setting rates, setting interest rates, setting like what are acceptable risk levels, setting the collateralization targets, deciding which kinds of collateral are like acceptable by the system. And so they have a governance forum. It's a discourse forum, so just think like a standard web forum, where they get together and discuss all these changes to the protocol. And they had an issue where the governance work is really important. Like this needs to happen for Maker to be secure and functional, but people were not really getting rewarded for doing this work. And anytime you're trying to build your system entirely on volunteer labor, you're going to run into issues where like, you know, people just have got lots of going on in their life and they can't afford maybe to prioritize it the way it needs to be prioritized. So they've been using SourceCred to compute cred scores on this governance form and then pay people DAI based on the contributions they're making. And the way that works is every time somebody makes a post on the forum, from SourceCred's perspective, this is a contribution, which is getting tracked and is flowing cred. So if I reply to your post, my post flows some cred to your post. If I mention you in my post, then my post flows some cred directly to you. And then it also, you know, flows according to the topic structure. And every time somebody likes a post on this forum, that is minting a little bit of cred, which then flows out. So if I like your post, some of it flows to you, some of it flows to the author of the post you referenced, some of it flows to the author of the topic that the post was a part of. And then in MakerDAO, rather than having grain as like a whole new token, their grain is effectively DAI. So they're paying people DAI based on the cred scores. Does that help make things
clear?
Yeah,
for communities that, totally, yeah. For communities that don't have DAI, are they issuing they just get cred, or did they just get grain, or are they sort of minting their own token and using that as the grain?
So one of the key things about SourceCred that I think differentiates it from other approaches to building like reputation networks in blockchain space is SourceCred is not trying to make a single network to like solve for everyone. Rather, every project is setting up their own cred network, their own cred instance, we call it. And they're choosing their own policies. So they're deciding where cred comes from, how it flows. You know, a project might say, we don't actually care about our forums. Like our forums, it's not very important to our work. So we're not going to mint any cred there. We really care about GitHub. So we're going to mint a bunch of cred on every merged pull request. Or we're going to use a whole different thing to mint cred. And similarly, every project has their own token, their own grain. So SourceCred has, we could call it SourceCred grain as like our digital currency. A project called Metagame that's using SourceCred is distributing a token called Seeds. So it really is like plug and play. You can put your own token into the system.
Got it. And now, you know, we were working through, you know, issuing some sort of reputation system within the BAF network, and we were getting kind of caught up on this idea of like weighting certain contributions. To me, that's like one of the most difficult things as for an organization to do, because, you know, things change and there's constant evaluation. And so we were kind of relying on the process of issuing badges instead. Like, hey, if you come to 5 BAF events, you get a badge, and that badge might be, you know, equal to X amount of grain or BAF token or whatever it may be. Is that something that like you take, I guess better question is, how is your template or sort of scaffolding that SourceCred provides support people in weighting these different alternatives? Because like, to me, that's the hardest thing right there, is like attaching a value to, you know, a reshare on Twitter or a GitHub commit. How have you done that for SourceCred, and have you seen others do
that? So I'd say, generally speaking, we're trying to avoid setting like prices for types of commits. So like, or types of contributions. So for example, you can imagine setting a price and like, oh, you get 5 points per meeting you attend. You get 6 points per commit. You get 9 points per retweet. And the issue is that these just tend to be really easy to game, because it's like, oh, you're paying me per commit. Great. I can like create 50 commits that each fix one typo in the documentation and like really like rake it in, or just make a bunch of meetings. What we're trying to go towards is a world in which we are valuing things. We're not, the sort of value is not on work, but on impact. So like writing a commit is work. Landing a feature is impact, especially if that's a feature that people really care about. And so the idea is that we will set a value on the feature, on the deliverable, on the top level goal, and then that cred will flow back to all the units of work. And so we can see that like a commit that like fixed a typo in the docs might not get very much cred because maybe no one really cared. But a single, so maybe 10 commits fixing typos will get very little cred, but one commit that like was the pivotal work for a feature we cared about could get a ton of cred. that's the goal. I would say it's something we're working towards, and right now we do tend to have something more like prices per element. So like a lot of our instances will have a rule like mint 8 cred per discourse like, after like adjusting for some heuristics where maybe you say, okay, this governance category should get a 2x multiplier. Users that are untrusted and made their account like 3 days ago should get a 0x multiplier, like kind of mixing in heuristics. So it's an area of like active R&D and improvement right now.
Is there anyone that is earning a livelihood based on the cred or the grain absolutely. That they're earning, like strictly from contributing? People. Cool, that's so awesome.
I would say
that's amazing. In SourceCred itself, or in the maker community, or both. Sort of across?
There are like, I think SourceCred itself has the highest density of people who are like getting paid entirely through SourceCred. I would guess that there's at least like 10 people now, maybe somewhere between 10 and 20 people where like SourceCred is their source of income. And I think also in like MakerDAO, there are people where, like I know a couple people who just like are contributing across various SourceCred instances, and that's their income.
Now, for that to, for them to like pay their bills with this, it has to be sort of exchangeable, like on an exchange, or be able to convert to dollars at this point. How do they go about that? Do you guys have relationships with exchanges? Or are you listed? Is it listed the SourceCred grain? Is that listed anywhere? Or is
SourceCred grain is not even in ERC20 right now. It really is just like a value in our Git ledger where we have just enshrined redeemability for 1 DAI per grain. So anyone who shows up in SourceCred, just for tax purposes, we have people like opt in to getting paid. Otherwise, they might get like income that they weren't expecting and like accidentally not pay the IRS. But once people opt in, they can just kind of come to the project and like redeem their grain for a DAI and then send the DAI to Coinbase or wherever they like. Other projects like OneHive and Maker and Metagame are directly pushing ERC20s to people based on the cred that they earn.
Nice. That's awesome. And to rewind a little bit, I'm curious if there have been attempts to socially game SourceCred in the past. And if that did happen, what were the biggest takeaways?
Yeah, so I would say there's been, I would call it like hard gaming and soft gaming. Hard gaming is where you kind of show up and you're like, yeah, I want to game this, and are kind of like clearly like an adversarial actor. Soft gaming is where you're not really trying to game it, but you are following the incentives, and the incentives are sufficiently misaligned that it kind of like looks like gaming. And it's like hard to tell them apart from the outside because it's a question of intent. We have seen both hard and soft gaming. As an example of soft gaming, like at one point, when I launched SourceCred, or when we turned on SourceCred initially, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't only developers getting rewarded by SourceCred. That seems like really important for the long-term health of the project. And so I set really high weights on our forums. So like getting a topic, posting a topic or like posting a post was seen as valuable as like writing a pull request, so that we could spread the cred a little bit more evenly. But that just meant that it actually takes far less work to make a post than to make a pull request. And so there were people who just started posting a lot and quickly got an enormous amount of cred. And so that was the first of many weight changes where we kind of rolled out new heuristics. We said, okay, we're going to mint cred based on likes, not based on just posts, because a like means that at least someone reviewed it. And a post, you can just churn these out without it necessarily being valuable to the discourse. And then changing the weights. And so that's been our response to like soft gaming. I would say OneHive is the community that's seeing clear hard gaming, where they kind of turned on SourceCred and then their token mooned. So all of a sudden they went from distributing, like a couple $1,000s a month over via SourceCred to like tens of thousands of dollars per week. And that brought people to their Discord who were really, I think, trying to game it explicitly. But once again, they were able to, just by changing the heuristics, they made it so that you needed to be a like trusted user who had been like verified as a non-Sybil member of the community. I think they connected it to Bright ID in order to mint cred, and that cleaned up the gaming problem quite effectively. And the nice thing again is that since cred is retroactive, if someone games it, and since cred is retroactive, you can just make it so that the token distribution biases a bit towards a long-term reward. And then if someone games it, but it's really obvious, then you just like fix it with a different set of weights, and it's not a big issue long-term.
Yeah, I'm super curious on that process of changing weights. Like, is there a board? Does everyone have the same sort of say? Is it based on how much cred you may have, to determine how
Right.
much, what weights can be changed? How does that look like within SourceCred
Yeah,
itself?
so my formal title within SourceCred is TBD, which stands for Temporary Benevolent Dictator. I'm kind of the personal like stand-in or proxy for having robust decentralized governance. So within SourceCred, the process for weight changing has been every once in a while, I'm like, hey, things are out of whack. Here's why I think they're out of whack. Here's like an analysis of the issue. Here's like my proposed fix. And then I kind of solicit feedback. I like update on the feedback, but I ultimately am making the decision on what to do. Uh, I'm not exactly sure. Like I know that neither like OneHive nor Metagame have TBD analogs. I want to say with MakerDAO, it's kind of been more consensus driven within like the MakerDAO SourceCred working group. Yeah, so I think this is one of the things that I'm really excited for us to do with SourceCred is to build better governance tools. And I'd like to make it so that anyone can kind of have their own credspective, their own set of weights that they're proposing. And then rather than make it like everyone needs to vote and decide on one policy, it's more like people can just support different perspectives and we'll kind of average between them. I think this kind of like intersubjective averaging, making it easy to come to consensus without requiring everyone to strictly agree, will be a really nice feature for governance.
Yeah, how do you go about, like, what's the forum in which you conduct such voting? Like, is it on a call? Because we're a nonprofit, like we're tax exempt. We have to have board calls, like board meetings. We have to do things sort of by a book. And we're just working on like, how do we optimize the forums? How do we, really only talk about the things that need to be talked about, or like, there's other points of discuss, like places where we can talk about other stuff, but like in formal meetings, let's just do voting. So how does SourceCred go about, the actual voting on things?
I mean, putting aside the fact we don't actually have actual voting because again, the governance processes that I decide at the moment. But the sort of place of record is our discourse forums. So I can put it in the chat if you want to take a look. But yeah, our forums, and I think that's, a lot of different crypto projects are using discourse forums as their like site of governance. And I think it works quite well.
Got it. Yeah, and I was also curious, like, how, if there are other like SourceCred SDKs to get in, like if you can incorporate it into, you mentioned blog posts, you mentioned GitHub, Twitter kind of, but like if there is a, let's say like Clubhouse event or any way that like you want to build an integration with another, even Web2 application, what are the mediums that are currently supported and which ones would you like to be supported?
Right. So currently we support GitHub, Discourse, and Discord, which is always confusing that Discourse and Discord have such similar names, but Discourse is forums, Discord is like servers for chat and video and such. One of the things we've really recognized is that it's super important to be able to recognize the like intangible contributions that don't happen on any particular platform. This talk is an example of running meetings, taking notes, recruiting people, fundraising. There's all kinds of stuff that like doesn't happen on GitHub or the forums. So our current priority from a product perspective is building a tool called the Creditor. You can think of it both as like it's a tool for crediting people, but it also is like for editing the cred and for editing the cred graph in particular. And we intend for this to be a tool that makes it really easy to add contributions wherever they came from and like record kind of, hey, here's why this was important. Here's the other contributions it depended on. And then let people like vote on how important it was to figure out how much credit should earn. I would also say like we do have a plugin system, and I would love to see in the future like a Slack plugin, a Twitter plugin, a Clubhouse plugin, anything else. We kind of need to like make those APIs a little bit cleaner, so it'll be easier to add more plugins.
Got it. Yeah, I want you to kind of dive a little bit deeper into the vision of SourceCred for beyond technical contributions, because I read this, SourceCred Manifesto Part 2, super cool. And you're talking about how, we need to, realign incentives to fix our medical system, our planet's environment, yada, yada, yada. And I totally agree that it really, I think the solution to these problems relies on rewiring the incentives. And SourceCred seems to be, one of the best projects that are tackling this huge issue, and it could be applied to so many different industries. So if you could just sort of paint the picture of how we can sort of what it looks like to move beyond technical contributions into other, non-tech applications like saving the environment.
So I think there's a couple different questions here, and I'll kind of like give a little airtime to the different like themes. The first thing I'll notice that SourceCred already is like, I feel confident saying we're beyond just rewarding technical contributions. Right now, the biggest flow of cred within the SourceCred community is we have a channel on the Discord called props, where anyone can say like props to Cameron for like hosting this redefining value call. Props to LB for doing a bunch of emotional labor to like support me through a difficulty I was having. And this is very much catching all kinds of contributions, not just technical ones. So I think like SourceCred does a good job, or at least an acceptable job right now of like rewarding design labor, emotional labor, logistical labor, project management labor. I think like if we were to like critique, like take a little bit of a zoom out and critique our current economic system, because I think it's pretty clear we have an economic system that is objectively failing at some of its most important jobs. So I think providing for healthcare for people is a clear like requirement of a healthy, functional economic system. And at least in the United States, it's really not doing that very well. Maintaining the world ecology and climate in like a sustainable realm for human survival and the broader like well-being of like living life on the planet clearly is an economic goal, and it's one that we are really failing at. And I think the root issue here is that we have an economic system that is built around valuing things transactionally. So the value of something is how much people are willing to pay for it, right? And like if you look at like the core metrics we use as a society, like GDP is basically the sum of all the transactions in the economy. And so that means if I can go and say, hey, give me $50,000 and I'll like help you with this tumor you've developed, that's like very good for GDP. If I go and give you a free cure to be more healthy and not need cancer meds to begin with, that actually didn't contribute at all to GDP. Having stuff like clean air and a healthy environment doesn't contribute anything to GDP. And so I think the fundamental issue here is that our economic system does not value the commons. It doesn't value stuff like open source, because if it's common, then you can't rate limit it and you can't put a price in front of it. And that means it doesn't exist from an economic perspective. And so what I see as the true like potential for SourceCred is to create an economic framework in which something doesn't need to be transactional to be valued, in which you can go and say, hey, it may be that I could have used IPFS for free, but because we did use it and it was super important, we're going to flow cred to it, regardless of whether it has like a pricing power. And if you think about an economic system, like some of the most important things we want, healthy communities, a healthy environment, mental health, these are things that are really hard to have pricing power for. And that's why I think we need a different economic paradigm so that we can start really like investing in the commons that we all need to survive.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it just goes back to education. Like we have to, educate people on how we currently view, this sort of transactional world, and how if we do change our outlook, what the future could be. And I've noticed, like just in general blockchain, I've been doing blockchain education for a couple of years now. It's good about like starting with the vision and having people feel like they can contribute to it directly. And how could people, I guess, like spread cred or SourceCred to people? Like, what do you think is the best way for people to start spreading the SourceCred message today? Is it through traditional educational, like, institutions? Is it mainly through like smaller communities? Do you think if we were to like get a government on board to start pushing this, do you think people are ready for that? I know there's a lot of questions there, but just the idea of like scaling this, how do you plan to scale this?
I'm really like a fundamentals boy. I really like believe in like having strong fundamentals and then building from there. And I think that my perspective right now is that like SourceCred, I think the fundamental concept is very strong, but there's still a ton of R&D to do before it like really works. And like we're running into this like through dog fooding SourceCred right now, in that if you look at the incentives within SourceCred in its current implementation, it produces a lot more of an incentive for doing work than for landing work or delivering work. So I think for taking Google as an example, because I worked at Google for many years, their incentive system is kind of broken in that it's very easy to get promoted for launching a new project. It's very hard to get promoted for just maintaining an existing product. And so the result is that they chronically are just like launching new things, running it for 1 year, and then turning it back off because nobody wanted to stick around and maintain it, because everyone just went on to like launch something new. And I think that with like SourceCred, like right now, like I have generally not put a lot of effort into promoting SourceCred. I'm not all over Twitter like raving about it, and partly that's because I'm like, cool, we need to like really like get this system to work. I think of it as like putting on our own oxygen mask before trying to like onboard a ton of other people into our like half-baked oxygen system.
Yeah.
So I think like what I think is like the best way to help SourceCred, and it's like a way that doesn't scale super well yet, is we need more like deeply engaged, like especially like product-minded people who want to help like bridge the gap between like the algorithm and the economic concept to having something that works well in reality. And I think for me, this is like the story of dog fooding. And it's like, I think that the way you build, I think a lot of people want to build complex, successful systems in a sort of top-down, like I'll design it, I'll get a bunch of resources, then I'll like build the design and then it'll work and it'll be great. But I think that what has really worked in practice is people turning on simple, shitty initial versions of the system and then letting the system like bootstrap itself at its own pace. And I think the whole crypto ecosystem is an example of this, right? It's not like Satoshi Nakamoto went and got governments on board with the idea of Bitcoin and like raised a bunch of funding and then like, started a company and hired a bunch of great talent. He just kind of like put out the tiny kernel of the system and then just disappeared. But the system like had a life of its own from that point onward, and it's like developing itself and realizing its own potential. And so I think of SourceCred as one of those like living systems in like the broader ecosystem that Bitcoin created, where it's now like growing of its own accord. And I think that one of the limiting resources is just time. Like Silicon Valley is obsessed with like blitz scaling, right? Taking like a simple pattern and growing it really, really quickly. And that has worked for creating big things, which is what venture capitalists are interested in, because like big equals big return. But if we were to look at the biological world for inspiration, it's like, okay, what are the things that get big really fast? Like rat populations, like E. coli in a petri dish. You get like simple things can grow very quickly. But if you look at the things that we find the most impressive, like humans like take a very long time to develop, like oak trees take a long time to develop. And so I think that the more that your ambition is to create something that's like really healthy, really going to last a long time, really going to grow with integrity, the more it tends to take like time and dedicated attention rather than just scaling resource availability.
Totally. And iterative feedback loops, which I think is, the key for the dog fooding. Now, with iterative feedback loops, you're going to get, you're going to run into problems like yourself or your peers will. And so what are some of the biggest problems that, SourceCred has experienced today internally? And yeah, let's just start there. Like some of the biggest things, like are things just, is the code breaking? Like what exactly is it? Obviously code breaks all the time, but is it you're rewiring the incentive system? There's just like so many components here. So what are the most common breaks?
So I would say like the deepest issue is that, and I think this is a problem that's plaguing all DAOs right now. We don't have a playbook for creating effective decentralized organizations. So we've got a playbook for creating effective centralized organizations, right? If you want to go and start like a Silicon Valley startup, there is a playbook. You can like copy what Google does for interviewing, copy what Uber does for growing, copy these other like successful Silicon Valley companies. And you also have got a big pool of people who essentially know how to play the game. And so you can like hire your, executives to scale the org. You can like poach project managers from Google. Once you're trying to make decentralized projects, there just isn't really a playbook, and stuff like how do you come to decisions and execute on them effectively without a central leader making the calls? how should we think about compensation? How should we think about responsibility? If something isn't working, like you can't really fire people from decentralized organizations. So how are you going to route around like how are you going to find those connections of humans, those teams that really like work really well together? So I would say that's the biggest issue is just not having a playbook to follow and needing to kind of reinvent how to work together in a new ethos and in a new space.
Got it. Yeah, our approach is, since we're tax exempt and have to abide by all these, laws and stuff, it's progressive decentralization. And what we're most focused on right now is just engagement. Like, how do we get people to want to stay here? Like, let's not even talk about decentralizing quite yet. Let's just talk about like creating an organization that people want to be a part of.
Yeah.
And, that align with like a mission and a vision of like what the future could be. And it seems like, you've done a pretty great job at that. I for those who don't know, I popped into the SourceCred Discord talk yesterday, and there's a bunch of people there. It was like probably 20, 30 people or so, or maybe 20, 20-ish. And they were engaged. People were super interested in like just the problem that you're solving. Like the solution obviously matters, but you're getting the people there because of the problem. So it seems, and that's sort of like what I've been trying to craft here, me and my team, of course, is just bringing people here for like the reason of, creating a decentralized future.
So I think people are like inspired by the problem, but I think the other aspect is that SourceCred has grown into a really like healthy kind of like nurturing and caring community. And I think that's something that's kind of rare in the crypto space. I think SourceCred is really like blessed to have some really like community-minded people who are helping organize the show. And so you met LB running the community call yesterday, and I think they've really done a lot to like make SourceCred a community and not just like a little like tech hangout. And I think that in a way this has been, one of the real growing pains for SourceCred. And I talked about not having a playbook to follow. I did not want to grow SourceCred through hiring. I had the resources. Protocol Labs was like willing to like give budget to like hire more engineers to work on SourceCred. And the issue was that I knew that with every additional hire would be another person working on SourceCred who like didn't actually care whether or not the algorithm was working because they're just getting paid by Protocol Labs no matter what.
Yeah.
And so SourceCred has not hired, and all the people working on SourceCred are doing it for some mixture of because they really like SourceCred, because they like the community, and because they're getting paid through the dog fooding by the algorithm. And so that has kind of forced us to like SourceCred, lots of companies can afford to be shitty places to work because everyone's like, well, this fucking sucks, but I'm getting paid, so I'll show up tomorrow anyway.
Yeah.
And SourceCred actually can't afford to suck, because if SourceCred sucks as a place to be, then there just won't be anywhere there. And I love working under these constraints. I think if you can find a way to be forced to do the right thing, it's way easier to do the right things, like build the right thing when you're forced to do it by the constraints you've chosen. So I don't know if that's like really an answer for you precisely, but I think, it's just worth thinking deeply about like, how can you make the space feel like welcoming and feel socially engaging? Because I think that's a huge part of what keeps people bringing it back. Like the vision is motivating, but it's the relationships and community that actually keep people.
Totally. Yeah. For BAF, we couldn't pay anyone for a very, very long time. And PG, our vice president, he just reached out to me on LinkedIn one day and was like, hey, I love what you're doing. And this community is really growing organically. And I'm trying to, now we're at this sort of convergence point where like, we need to keep people around. We want to pay them. Like paying people is very important to like make sure that they can dedicate the time and energy towards it. And the issue sort of with this is that a lot of these people they're knowledgeable about blockchain. The blockchain space is competitive. They can go get a job at a company, making a decent amount of money. So how can we sort of identify what motivates them and figure out how to give them those things? And like, we do this right now, just like a membership application where everyone, and this is kind of how we're like Sybil resistant, is you just have to fill out a form. And the form is like relatively not long, but we make it long enough so people aren't just going to fill it out for just not to be a part of it. So how have you, I know you briefly mentioned this earlier, but Sybil resistance in decentralized communities is really, really important. How have you addressed this issue with SourceCred?
I would say right now, like a very large portion of SourceCred work and engagement happens on calls like this one, where not everyone has video on, but many people have video on, and pretty much most people are contributing through like audio. And at the scale of like having an active engaged membership of, let's say, like 50 people, it's really hard to pretend to have two faces or to pretend to have two voices. So civils have just not really been an issue as a consequence. I would also say right now the incentives are not like SourceCred. Really, you get paid per unit work more so than per unit of identity. So the effort that you spent on like sneaking an extra account into SourceCred doesn't actually get very much reward compared to spending that same effort on like actually doing something the community cares about.
Got it. That makes sense. Very cool. Well, I know you have a hard stop at 5 p.m. Pacific, so I'm going to move on to some of the community questions. The first one that has the most votes is there a method that rewards cred to quality of contributions as compared to simply quantity of connections? Is it based on public governance / opinion? It sounds like you covered this a little bit, but if you don't mind just sort of answering it again, that'd be wonderful.
So I think it's interesting, like the question I have to notice is the distinction between quality of contribution and quantity of connections. So I do want to first note that I think that when it comes to the connections, quantity has a quality all of its own, in that a contribution, which is like actually like meaningfully depended on by lots of other things, is that's like a pretty good sign that it was a quality contribution of some kind. If you were to go and look at, for example, at scientific research papers, those papers which are got tons of citations are usually like genuinely pretty important. But it is still the case that not all connections are the same, right? If we consider, like, let's say I've got a physics paper that's got 2 citations, and one citation is like, thanks to Einstein for a theory of relativity, and one paper is like, also thanks to this guy for an experimental measurement of the speed of light out to like 14 decimal places as opposed to 13 decimal places. Like, clearly they're both important, but relativity is more important than the extra decimal place of precision. And so indeed, like, we are building a system that allows you to distinguish, like, yes, this was connected, but like, was this connected like foundationally, or was this connected kind of incidentally? And the idea is to make this, like, it's close to public governance. It definitely is permissionless governance, but the principle we're trying to build towards is locality of responsibility. And so what I mean by this is, let's say that we want to like say like how we want to have the node representing this call, and we want to have connections to like me, to Cameron, to PG, to everyone else who's involved in producing this. When we are voting on which contributions were most important, some random person in SourceCred who wasn't at this call, like even if they've got a lot of cred in other parts of the project, maybe they're like an amazing engineer, they should not have much voting power because they weren't involved in this. So like, what do they even know? Whereas like Cameron might not have as much credit in like absolute terms as some like SourceCred core engineer, but Cameron's got way more relevant information about like who was involved in this particular thing. So we're going to try to have it be local governance, where the closer you were to doing the work, the more say you have in which pieces of work were the most important.
Yep, I love that, and also really touches upon, I think, the importance of empowering local communities generally. Like, take this sort of outside of tech. Like, if we were able to, even just support our local communities, buy local, spend local, like it stays within, it builds the connections. And this is something that we're definitely focused in. One of the things tangibly is projects with BAF, because we have all these different blockchain clubs, and it seems like people are more interested in building projects within their school, in their club, than BAF generally. And I think that that's just like a really interesting takeaway, because there's, they identify more with their club and with their, their school than sometimes BAF itself. Now, when they graduate, it's a different story. But like, they shouldn't, I don't know, there's a lot of questions to answer, like how to actually apply this to an organization with so many different interests and people. So I'm definitely going to look more into sort of like the specs of applying SourceCred into a community. And I was curious, where people can look for resources here. Like, how would one start using SourceCred today?
So if somebody wanted to use SourceCred today, there's sort of 2 dimensions of using SourceCred. There's using SourceCred for your project, where you're like turning on a new cred instance. and there's using SourceCred in the sense of contributing to an existing project using SourceCred. So like getting paid by SourceCred. If you mean how would someone go around like turning on a new SourceCred instance, Proviso, I would still consider SourceCred in effect like in sort of alpha level technology, maybe like early beta, somewhere between those, but it's definitely kind of unpolished. It definitely requires a bit of technical expertise to like maintain the system. But if you go to, we have a GitHub, I'll just put it in the chat. There's a template instance on GitHub. And the idea is that every SourceCred instance right now is just hosted as a repository on GitHub. So especially if you've got like a Discord or a Discourse or GitHub, but I think that only captures a small slice of the community usually. Then you can just use that template instance to kind of fork from it and turn on your own SourceCred instance. And then if you want, you can start distributing your own grain. The way that SourceCred ensures its grain is valuable is basically it's backed by funding that the project has. So if you want to start paying people through the project's funding, you can just do that. It's moderately easily. I mean, honestly, there's some overhead in it, but it's definitely doable. If, on the other hand, you want to get involved in a project using SourceCred, you can start posting on the MakerDAO forums. You could come to a SourceCred community call. Those are on our Discord every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific. You could get involved in metagame. Like if you just start participating in any project using SourceCred, then you'll start earning cred in that particular project.
Got it. And what kind of like systems do you use for identity management? Because, I have my Discord handle. I participated in the call yesterday. Am I getting cred unknowingly? Is there somebody like managing that?
Yeah.
Sort of, does it happen automatically? Is there like a form I have to fill out? How does it work on like the identity management side?
Yeah, so we basically treat every plugin can provide its own canonical identities. So indeed, your Discord handle is already earning cred. But then the issue is that maybe you post on GitHub or Discourse, and that's like conceptually a separate identity. We support identity linking. So you can go and like right now, it's actually you would submit a form if you wanted to start earning grain in SourceCred. You need to fill out the form in which you basically say, I acknowledge that this is probably taxable income and it's my responsibility to pay my own taxes. And then in that form, you can like say, oh yeah, here's my GitHub handle, here's my Discord handle, and get them linked by an instance administrator. We're working on making that more self-service and more portable across SourceCred instances, but that's kind of an area of active development so far.
Got it. Very cool. Another question from the audience. Do you think creating hype should be rewarded or penalized?
I think it's hard to say in general. It depends on the hype. This is like most things, it depends on the detail. I would say like Cameron, insofar as you during this thing on like creating hype for SourceCred by kind of sharing genuine enthusiasm for SourceCred in a way that is also like informative about what SourceCred is, I think that like is valuable and should be rewarded. I think if somebody were to start going and spamming Twitter, being like SourceCred, it'll like do your dishes for you, and like once you turn it on, everything will be fixed forever. Like that's not useful hype.
Yeah.
I think also this is something that different communities are going to have different opinions on. I am sure that in the coming years, we're going to see a community using SourceCred with like a Twitter plugin and stuff where they are just really like strong in their meme game, and they're going to be rewarding people in the community for coming up with good memes. And it'll be cool to see.
That's awesome. Is the pairing of grain and the ERC20
so
automated?
Right now, it is not. And this is a source of great pain to our instance administrators, people running SourceCred instances where there's a lot of manual work to like make sure that the ERC20 is getting distributed according to the like SourceCred ledger. This is definitely a priority for us. I want to move SourceCred to become a lot more on-chain this year, where I want us to like, right now SourceCred is kind of funded through like a shadowy deal with Protocol Labs, where Protocol Labs is providing money so that we can redeem grain. And since SourceCred is, a decentralized project that intends to be independent and kind of standing on its own feet, we're going to be investing this year in building a better automated interop between the SourceCred algorithm and the token distributions on chain.
Got it. Yeah, that's definitely, relevant for us. And yes, Protocol Labs is also
Yeah.
supporting us. And but the ultimate goal is how do we create like, a self-sustaining system where there are revenue streams and, we can pay out, let's say, the BAF token through the money that we make through recruiting and
yeah. So
through other
SourceCred
things.
already does have revenue coming in because the projects that are using SourceCred have generally agreed to flow a fraction of their cred back to SourceCred. And so we're getting paid in, like, for example, like SourceCred has got now something like $100,000 worth of seeds, from metagame, because conceptually you can think of it as metagame. It's just giving a fraction of its seeds back to SourceCred. Another project that I'm kind of in the early stages of working on, which is based on SourceCred, is called the Cred Federation. And it's basically going to be a system for projects to flow tokens to each other based on cred-like principles. So like at SourceCred, we really want to be flowing cred to Discourse, to Ethereum, to all the other tech that we depend on. And we hope that other projects using SourceCred will want to flow some of their cred to us. So we're going to start building more and more infrastructure. And the idea is we want to make it so that every open source project has revenues in proportion to their utility, regardless of whether or not they've got a way to actually charge people for the software.
I love it. It's a hell of a vision. Christopher Thompson says, have you explored the alignments in non-digital ROWE results only work environments, platform models? Have you explored the alignments in other non-digital results only work environments, platform models? And he has a link here.
I don't actually know. I'm not familiar with the term, so I can't really comment to it.
Okay. Got it. More questions from the community. How does cred weight adapt quickly as value of a specific labor changes day to day on a project's timeline?
I'm not exactly sure I quite understand the premise here of like, what does it mean for the value of specific labor to be changing day to day on a project's timeline? Is the idea that like, Tuesday we needed lots of developer work, but then Wednesday we were like, we've got too many developers, we want more like documentation. Assuming that is kind of the idea, that like at different times you like might realize you're underweight or overweight different kinds of labor. In the medium term, we want to make it easy through governance for people to like vote on what to fund. So maybe we've got tons of developers, but nobody doing documentation. Maybe we'll kind of think, oh, we all want to actually vote to like give more rewards to people doing documentation so we can like plug that gap. So that's part of the like governance system that we're intending to develop over time.
Got it. And you said you're trying to, get more things to be on chain. Is this on ETH itself? And if so, if it is on ETH, right, how are you dealing with gas? I tried to make a transaction today. It's $200. I didn't do it.
Right. So the SourceCreed algorithm involves like running PageRank on extremely large graphs. So it's definitely not feasible to run on the blockchain. What we are doing is it's kind of like easy to verify in that like anyone can get the SourceCred graph and recompute it, get it off GitHub, recompute it and check that the scores match. In the longer term, I imagine maybe building like either using a TrueBit style solution to like do like graph PageRank verification on chain, or building a custom blockchain for computing cred scores. But for now, it's more treated as an oracle, as an off-chain oracle.
Got it. Very cool. And one thing that I'm now doing for Near Protocol, the company I work with, I'm now managing bounties. And I was curious how you go about letting the community know what needs to be built. Is this all on Discourse? And can anyone ask for certain things to be built?
Right. Yeah, right now that prioritization all happens on the social layer of like people being in meetings and kind of talking about what feels important. And then since a lot of the reward is gated through the social layer as well, those kind of like converge, where if you work on stuff people think is important, you'll get a lot more like props and like support and like enthusiasm from the community, which means you'll get paid more. I really want to build like cred weighted prioritization where like maybe you can stake or burn grain in order to increase the cred of something that you think is important. And then that will create an incentive to work on it. So yeah, I think that's super important, but we're also not there quite yet.
Got it. We are running up on time, so I was curious if you have anything else that you want, the community to know about the project. You already kind of mentioned about how they can get involved, but if there's anything else you'd like to add,
yeah,
is the time.
I would say as far as getting involved, yeah, come to a community call Tuesdays, 11 Pacific, on our Discord if you're interested. Maybe my parting words of wisdom would just be to reiterate that I think it's so empowering. If you're trying to start a new crypto project, try to get it to be a live project as soon as possible, rather than letting it be a dead project that's just like living in your head in like a design phase. Because once it's live, it starts to teach you what it needs to grow. And I've seen, I myself would say that like the first year of SourceCred development, I could have turned SourceCred on so much sooner. And I think we'd be about a year ahead in terms of our own timeline. But I spent a year leaving it as just a sort of algorithm that I was trying to figure out what to do with. And it was only once I turned SourceCred on itself and started using SourceCred to pay everyone involved that SourceCred really started to take off. So I think it's super important when you're trying to build new systems to turn them on as soon as possible.
And the dog fooding seems like that was a really good job.
Yeah, it was vital.
Got it. Cool. And so Dandelion, thank you so much for joining. For those, actually, is there anywhere else that people can learn more about you or more about you?
You can follow me on Twitter. I've decided to be a shit poster. I make no warranty for the quality or accuracy of any of my tweets. And, I'm just trying to have fun with the medium, honestly, but you're welcome to follow me on Twitter. I'm Decentralion, like a decentralized lion,
Love it. Very cool. Well, thank you again. And for everyone else, feel free to stick around for the networking portion. Unfortunately, Dandelion has a hard stop at 8, so he will not be joining us. But hope we can do this again in a little while or a long while. And stay in touch. We plan to also, incorporate SourceCred into our community. So let's see how that goes.
Thanks for having me.
But thanks again. And
cheers.
Yep. See everyone in networking. Bye.